German Philosophy, 1789 to 1815. Our approach to the idealistic philosophy of Kant and his successors is obstructed by the current preemption of the word ideal for moral excellence, and by our habit in an age of science and industry of thinking of things perceived and seldom of the process of perception itself. The opposite attitudes competed in Greek philosophy, where Democritus took atoms as his starting point and Plato took ideas. In modern philosophy, Bacon stressed knowledge of the world, Descartes began with the thinking self. Hobbes reduced everything to matter, Berkeley to mind. Kant gave German philosophy its distinctive character by arguing that its prime task is the study of the process by which we form ideas. He admitted the reality of external objects, but insisted that we can never know what they objectively are, since we know them only as changed by the organs and processes of perception into our ideas. Philosophical idealism is therefore the theory that nothing is known to us except ideas, and that therefore matter is a form of mind. 1. Fichte, 1762 to 1814. 1. The Radical. Here, as so often in literary history, the man has proved more interesting than his books. These suffer erosion by the flux of fashions in ideas and forms, but the study of a soul picking its way through the labyrinth of life is a living lesson in philosophy, an ever-moving picture of experience, molding character and transforming thought. Johann Gottlieb Fichte crowded a brave variety of experience into his 52 years. His father was a Saxon ribbon weaver. His mother prayed that her boy should be a pastor. He agreed, and after some local schooling he was sent to Jena to study theology. The more he studied, the more he wondered and doubted. A village preacher gave him a refutation of the errors of Spinoza. Fichte was charmed by the errors and decided that he was not fit for a pastorate. Nevertheless, he graduated in the faculty of theology. Almost penniless, he walked from Jena to Zurich to secure a post as tutor. There he fell in love with Johanna Maria Rahn and was formally betrothed to her, but they agreed not to marry till he was financially adult. He moved to Leipzig, tutored, read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and was fascinated. He made his way to Königsberg and presented Kant an essay toward a critique of all revelation, this in 1792. The old philosopher balked at Fichte's request for a loan, but helped him to find a publisher for his treatise. The printer neglected to state the author's name. When a critic ascribed the essay to Kant, Kant named the author and praised the book. Fichte was at once received into the not quite serene brotherhood of philosophers. He did not do so well with the theologians, for the argument of his treatise was that although revelation does not prove the existence of God, we must ascribe our moral code to God, if that code is to be accepted and obeyed by mankind. On Kant's recommendation, Fichte found remunerative employment as a tutor in Danzig. His betrothed now agreed to add her savings to his income, and on that basis they were married in 1793. He further signalized the year by publishing, anonymously, 2 vigorous essays. In The Restoration of Freedom of Thought by the Princes of Europe, he began by praising some enlightened rulers and berated princes who obstructed the progress of the human mind. And he mourned the wave of repression that had followed the death of Frederick the Great. Reform is better than revolution, for a revolution can throw man back into barbarism. And yet a successful revolution can advance mankind as much in half a century as reform could have done in 1,000 years. Then Fichte addressed his readers, at a time when feudalism was still in force through most of Germany. Hate not your princes, but yourselves. One of the sources of your misery is your exaggerated estimate of these personages, whose minds are warped by an enervating education, indulgence, and superstition. These are the men who are exhorted to suppress freedom of thought. Cry aloud to your princes that you will never permit your freedom of thought to be filched from you. The dark ages are over, when you were told in God's name that you were herds of cattle set on earth to fetch and carry, to serve a dozen mortals in high place, and to be their possessions. You are not their property, not even God's property, but your own. You will now ask the prince who wishes to rule you, By what right? If he replies, by inheritance, you will ask, how did the first of your line obtain the right? The prince derives his whole power from the people. The second tract, Essay Toward the Correction of the Public's Judgment on the French Revolution, was still more radical. Feudal privileges should not be hereditary. They exist by consent of the state, and should be terminable at the state's convenience. Likewise with ecclesiastical property. It exists through permission and protection by the state, and may be nationalized when the nation's need and will so decree. The French National Assembly did this and was justified. Here the fragment ends. Only by noting that these pronouncements were published anonymously can we understand how Fichte won an invitation, in December 1793, to the chair of philosophy at Jena. Duke Charles Augustus was still an easygoing lord of Weimar and Jena, and Goethe, who supervised the university faculty, had not yet decided that the French Revolution was a romantic disease. So Fichte began his courses at Jena in the Easter term of 1794. He was a persuasive teacher, a lively orator, who could put feeling into philosophy and make metaphysics lord of all. But his impetuous temper was thoroughly unprofessional and promised intellectual turbulence. 5 of his early discourses were published in 1794 as Some Lectures on the Vocation of the Scholar. Their thesis, that the state will in some amiable future disappear and leave men really free, was almost as anarchistic as Godwin's Enquiry Concerning Political Justice, published a year before. Political society is no part of the absolute purpose of human life, but is only a possible means to the formation of a perfect society. The state constantly tends toward its own annihilation, since the final aim of all government is to render itself superfluous. We may have to wait for eons, but one day all political combinations will become unnecessary. To this prospect, made palatable to princes by its distance, Fichte added another Pisca view. The ultimate aim of society is the perfect equality of all its members. This was a resounding echo of Jean-Jacques, and Fichte did not disown the parentage. Peace be with Rousseau's ashes, and blessings on his memory, for he has kindled fires in many souls. The romantic rebels who were to congregate in Jena in 1796 welcomed this summons to utopia. The greatest metaphysician now alive, wrote Friedrich von Schlegel to his brother, is a popular writer. You can see it in his famous book on the Revolution. Contrast the contagious eloquence of the Lectures on the Scholar with Schiller's declamations. Every trait in Fichte's public life seems to say, this is a man. 2. The Philosopher. What was this metaphysics that so charmed the Romantics? Its central thesis was that the individual self-conscious ego, whose essence is will and whose will is free, is the center and sum of all reality. Nothing could have pleased the Romantics more. But the matter was not as simple as Friedrich von Schlegel's Lucinda. Fichte himself, after publishing his Grundlage der gesamten Wissenschaftslehre, Foundation of the Whole Science of Knowledge, in 1794, found it necessary to clarify it post factum in 1797 by a Zweite Einleitung, second introduction, and by a Neue Darstellung, new presentation, each of which added fresh absurdities. The key word itself needed a key. Wissenschaftslehre means a study of the shaft or trunk of knowledge, i.e. the mind, or to put it in one forbidding word, epistemology. Fichte began by dividing philosophers into 2 groups, dogmatists or realists, who are confident that objects exist independently of the mind, and idealists, who believe that all experience and all facts are mental percepts, and that therefore all reality, so far as we can know, is part of the perceiving mind. He objected to realism that it is logically driven to a mechanistic determinism which makes consciousness superfluous and undermines responsibility and morality, whereas freedom of the will is among the most immediate and tenacious of our convictions. Fichte objected further that no philosophy which begins with matter can explain consciousness, which is manifestly immaterial. But the main problems of philosophy concern this mysterious reality called consciousness. So Fichte began with the conscious itself, the ego, ich, or I. He acknowledged an external world, but only as known to us through our perceptions. These, by their very process, the interpretation of sensations through memory and purpose, transform the object into a part of the mind. So a word as a sound is quite different from that word as interpreted by experience, context, and aim, and a storm, which to mere sensation is a confused and meaningless medley of messages falling upon various senses, becomes in perception, through memory, circumstance, and desire, a stimulus to meaningful action. Fichte concluded that we must assume an external object or non-ego as cause of our external sensations, but that the object, as interpreted by perception, memory, and will, is a construct of the mind. From this point of view, both the subject and the object are parts of the ego, and nothing outside of the ego can ever be known. All this is but one aspect of Fichte's philosophy. Behind the self as perceiving is the self as desiring, willing. The ego is a system of impulses. Its very nature is tendency or impulse. The whole system of our ideas depends upon our impulses and our will. Here Fichte touches upon Spinoza's desire is the very essence of man, and leads to Schopenhauer's view of the world as will and idea. This restless will is not part of that objective world which seems a slave to mechanistic determinism. Hence the will is free. This freedom is the essence of man, for it makes him a responsible moral agent, capable of freely obeying a moral law. As he proceeded, Fichte developed Kant's admiration of astronomic and moral order into a new theology, which assumed a moral law as governing and supporting the universe as well as the character and communities of men. Finally, he identified this moral order of the universe, each part, so to speak, doing its duty and thereby maintaining the whole, with God. The goal and duty of the free man is to live in harmony with this divine moral order. That cosmic moral order is not a person but a process, principally visible in the moral development of mankind. The vocation of man is to live in harmony with that divine order. All this again recalls Spinoza, but in another mood Fichte suggests Hegel. The individual self or soul is mortal, but it shares in the immortality of that totality of conscious selves which is the absolute ego, idea, or soul. In Fichte's philosophy, we feel the anxious groping of a man who has lost his transmitted religious faith, but is struggling to find for himself and his readers or pupils a middle way between belief and doubt. In 1798, he faced the problem again in On the Ground of Our Belief in a Divine Governance of the World. He reaffirmed his conception of God as the impersonal moral order of the world, but he allowed that some might ascribe personality to this deity in order to vivify their concept and devotion. However, he added that to conceive God as a tyrant on whose favor future pleasures depend is to worship an idol, and those who worship it should be called atheists. An anonymous critic denounced the treatise as irreligious. Others joined in the attack. The government of Saxony confiscated all available copies of Fichte's essay and lodged a complaint with the Weimar government for allowing atheism to be taught within its jurisdiction. The Educational Committee at Weimar tried to quiet the matter with a polite reply to the Saxons, but Fichte, who was no pacifist, issued 2 pamphlets in public defense of his book, this in 1799. One of them a direct appellation an das Publikum. The Weimar Committee took this appeal to the public as a challenge to its handling of the matter, and a rumor reached Fichte that it would ask the University Senate to impose a public censure upon him. Arguing that this would violate academic freedom, Fichte wrote to Privy Councillor Voigt of Weimar that if such a censure should be issued, he would resign, and he added that several other professors had agreed, in such case, to resign with him. The Weimar Committee, Schiller and Goethe assenting, issued a rescript to the University Senate desiring it to censure Fichte. Then, accepting Fichte's threat and challenge, it dismissed him. 2 petitions were submitted to the students for a recall of this edict. They were ignored. In July 1799, Fichte and his wife moved to Berlin, where he was warmly received by Friedrich von Schlegel, Schleiermacher, and others of the Romantic circle, who sensed the romantic flavor of Fichte's imagination and the heroic egoism of his philosophy. To save the cost of a separate household, Fichte, with his unwilling wife, accepted Schlegel's invitation to live with him and Brendel Mendelssohn Veit. The volatile philosopher liked the ensemble and proposed to enlarge it. "If my plan succeeds," he wrote, "the Schlegels, Schelling, and we ourselves will form one family, take a larger house, and have only one cook." The plan was not carried out, for Carolina von Schlegel did not get along with Brendel. Individualism is the snake in every socialist paradise. Fichte, however, kept a socialist tinge to the end. In 1800 he published an essay, The Closed Commercial State, in which he argued that foreign trade and manipulations of currency enabled the richer nations to drain poorer nations of their metallic wealth. Therefore, the government should control all foreign commerce and possess all negotiable bullion and currency. Armed with this power, the state should guarantee to every individual a living wage and an equitable share in the national product. In return, the individual must yield to the state the power to fix prices and to determine the place and character of his work. Strangely contemporary with this radical pronouncement was a religious tract, The Vocation of Man, of 1800, which described God as the moral order of the universe and rose to an ecstasy of adoration. Our faith in duty is only faith in Him, in His reason and His truth. That eternal will is assuredly the creator of the world. We are eternal because He is eternal. Sublime and living will, named by no name, compassed by no thought. Thou art best known to a childlike, devoted, simple mind. I hide my face before Thee, and lay my hand upon my mouth. How Thou art, and seemest to Thine own being, I can never know. Thou workest in me the knowledge of my duty, of my vocation in the world of reasonable beings. How, I know not, nor need I know. In the contemplation of these, Thy relations to me, will I rest in calm blessedness. Apparently dependent upon public lectures and their publication for his livelihood, Fichte moved more and more toward Christian piety and German patriotism. In 1805 he was called to the chair of philosophy at the University of Erlangen. He was making a new reputation for himself there when the entry of Napoleon's army into Germany in 1806 compelled him to seek a safer post. He crossed into East Prussia and for a time taught in Königsberg. Soon the vicinity of Napoleon's troops at nearby Friedland forced him to move, this time to Copenhagen. In August 1807, weary of homelessness, he made his way back to Berlin. There he put philosophy aside and gave his energy to helping restore the pride and spirit of a shattered and humiliated people. 3. The Patriot. On Sundays from December 13, 1807 to March 20, 1808, in the amphitheater of the Berlin Academy, Fichte delivered the lectures later published as Reden an die Deutsche Nation. They were his passionate appeal to his people to regain their self-respect and courage, and to take measures for raising themselves out of the desolation brought upon them by the saber-rattling conceit of the Prussian military caste, the inhumane peace of Tilsit, and the brutal dismemberment of the Prussian kingdom by the victorious Corsican. Meanwhile, French soldiers were policing the captured capital, and French spies were checking every speech. These addresses to the German nation are the most living part of Fichte's legacy and are still warm with the feeling of the philosopher-turned-patriot. They put aside the intellectual game of theoretical logic and faced the bitter realities of Prussia's darkest year. He spoke not to Prussia alone, but to all Germans, and though their scattered principalities hardly constituted a nation, they used the same language and needed the same goad. He sought to bring them some unity by reminding them of German history, of famous victories, and achievements in statesmanship, religion, literature, and art, and by rejecting the hopeless materialism which he claimed to find in English life and theory, and the religious denudation of the French Enlightenment and Revolution. He spoke with reasonable pride of the mercantile cities of the older Germany, the Nuremberg of Albrecht Dürer, the Augsburg of the Fuggers, the globe-running burghers of the Hanseatic League. Present defeats, Fichte told his class and his country, must be seen in the perspective of a brilliant past. This imprisonment of one nation by another could not last. The German people had, in their national character, the resources of body, mind, and will that would make this present nadir end. How? Fichte answered, by a complete reform of education. its extension to every German child by governmental financing and compulsion, and the transformation of its purpose from commercial success to moral commitment. No more talk of revolution. There is only one revolution, and that is the enlightenment of the mind and the cleansing of the character. The child's abilities must be developed by the method of Pestalozzi, and they must be directed to national goals determined by the state. The state must be led by educated and dedicated men. It must be not the power of an army, but the direction and implementation of the national will. Every citizen must be the servant of the state, and the state must be the servant of all. Till now, by far the largest part of the state's income has been spent in maintaining a standing army, and the education of children has been left to clergymen who used God as a means to introduce self-seeking into other worlds after the death of the mortal body. Such a religion shall indeed be borne to the grave along with the past age. It must be replaced by a religion of moral consciousness based upon an educated sense of communal responsibility. To produce this new type of man, Fichte believes, the pupils should be separated from the adult society and form a separate and self-contained community. Physical exercises, farming, and trades of various kinds, in addition to the development of the mind by learning, are included in this commonwealth. So isolated from the corruptions of the dying past, the pupils, by work and study, should be stimulated to create an image of the social order of mankind as it ought to be, simply in accordance with the law of reason. The pupil is so filled with ardent love for such an order of things that it will be utterly impossible for him not to desire it, and to work with all his strength to promote it, when freed from the guidance of education. It is a splendid dream, recalling Plato's Republic and forecasting the socialist prophets who would stir the hopes of succeeding centuries. It had little influence on its time and little share, though this has been magnified, in raising national ardor against Napoleon. But Fichte was thinking of something larger than the expulsion of the French from Prussia. He was trying to find a way of improving that human character which, for good and evil, has made much of history. In any case, it was a noble dream, too confident perhaps in the power of education over heredity, and sadly open to misconception and misuse by authoritarian regimes. But, Fichte said, as I care to live only for that hope, I cannot give up hoping that I shall convince some Germans that it is education alone that can save us. The hardships of his flight from Erlangen to Königsberg to Copenhagen to Berlin had permanently weakened him. Shortly after completing his addresses to the German nation, his health broke down. He went to Teplitz and partly recovered. In 1810, he was made rector of the new University of Berlin. When Prussia opened its War of Liberation, Fichte aroused his students to such patriotic fervor that nearly all of them enlisted. Fichte's wife volunteered for service as a nurse. She caught an apparently fatal fever. He attended her during the day and lectured at the university in the evening. He caught the ailment from her. She survived. He died, January 27, 1814. 5 years later, she was laid beside him in that good old custom of burial which allowed lovers and mates to be joined again, even though but hair and bones, in symbol of their having been, and of being now again, one. 2. Schelling, 1775 to 1854. Though he recognized the existence of an external world, Fichte's philosophy mostly avoided it, except as purified by perception. Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph von Schelling, despite his aristocratic preposition, readily accepted nature and united it with mind in a condominion constituting God. He was the son of a propertied Lutheran pastor in Württemberg, was pledged to the ministry, and studied in the theological faculty at Tübingen. There, he, Hölderlin, and Hegel formed a lusty trio of scholastic radicals, celebrating the French Revolution, redefining deity, and making new philosophic mixtures of Spinoza, Kant, and Fichte. Schelling added a poem entitled The Creed of an Epicurean. One could safely predict from these juvenilia a respectably conservative old age. Like Fichte and Hegel, he served for some years as a tutor. His essay, The I as Principle of Philosophy, published in 1795 when he was 20, caught the attention of Fichte, and won Schelling at 23 an invitation to teach philosophy at Jena. He was content for a time to describe himself as a follower of Fichte and to accept mind as the sole reality. But at Jena, and later at Berlin, he joined the Romantics and gave the body a passing ecstasy. "I can bear it no longer. I must live once more, must let my senses have free play, these senses of which I have been well-nigh deprived by the grand transcendental theories to which they have done their utmost to convert me. But I too will now confess how my heart leaps and the hot blood rushes through my veins. I have no religion but this, that I love a well-shaped knee, a fair plump bosom, a slender waist, flowers with the sweetest odors, full satisfaction of all my desires, the granting of all that sweet love can ask. If I am obliged to have a religion, though I can live most happily without it, then it must be the Catholic, such as it was in the olden days, when priests and laity lived together, and in the house of God itself there was daily revelry." It was fitting that so ardent a lover of tangible reality should startle the idealistic nimbus that surrounded Fichte at Jena, and that remained behind him when he left for Berlin. In First Sketch of a System of Natural Philosophy of 1799, and in System des transcendentalen Idealismus of 1800, Schelling defined the main problem of philosophy as the apparent impasse between matter and mind. It seems impossible to think of either producing the other, and he concluded, in one more return to Spinoza, that the best escape from the dilemma is to think of mind and matter as two attributes of one complex but unified reality. All philosophy absolutely, which is based upon pure reason alone, is or will become Spinozism. But that philosophy, Schelling thought, was so rigidly logical as to miss vitality. A dynamic conception of nature must necessarily bring about one essential change in the views of Spinozism. In its rigidity, Spinozism could be regarded like Pygmalion's statue as needing to be given a soul. To make this dualistic monism more conceivable, Schelling proposed to think of force or energy as the inner essence of both matter and mind. In neither case do we know what this force is, but since we see it taking in nature progressively subtler forms, from the mystery of communicated motion through the attraction or repulsion of articles, the sensitivity of plants, or the groping, grasping pseudopodia of the amoeba, to the quick intelligence of the chimpanzee and the conscious reason of man, we may conclude that the basic reality, the one omnipresent God, is neither matter nor mind by itself, but their union in one incredible panorama of forms and powers. Here Schelling was writing poetry as well as philosophy, and both Wordsworth and Coleridge found in him a fellow spirit, struggling to build a new faith for souls overwhelmed by science and hungering for God. In 1803, he left Jena to teach in the recently opened University of Würzburg. He continued to write philosophical treatises, but they lacked the vigor of his natural philosophy. In 1809, his stimulating wife, Carolina, died and seemed to take half of his vitality with her. He married again in 1812 and wrote incontinently, but he published nothing after 1809. Besides, by that time, Hegel had become the unchallenged Napoleon of philosophy. In his declining years, Schelling found comfort in mysticism and transcendental explanations for the apparent contradictions between a loving God and a nature red in tooth and claw, and between the determinism of science and the free will apparently needed for moral responsibility. He took from Jakob Böhme, 1575 to 1624, the idea that God himself is a battleground between good and evil, so that nature oscillates between struggling for order and relaxing into chaos. And in man, too, there is something basically irrational. Ultimately, Schelling promised his readers, all evil will be overcome, and divine wisdom will succeed in transforming even the follies and crimes of mankind into good. He had now the long discomfort of seeing Hegel gather all the crowns of philosophy, and then to survive him by 23 years, while the young Hegelians divided their master's dialectical remains between communism and reaction. In 1841, King Frederick William IV called Schelling to the chair of philosophy at the University of Berlin, hoping that his conservatism would stem the radical tide. But Schelling could not hold his audience, and he was left stranded and wondering by the rush of events from philosophy to revolution. Even so, Wordsworth had already put Schelling's pantheistic vitalism into majestic verse, and Coleridge had ascribed to him, with certain exceptions, the completion and the most important victories of the Kantian revolution in philosophy. And half a century after Schelling's death, Henri Bergson, regenerator of vitalism, called Schelling one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Hegel would have demurred. 3. Hegel, 1770 to 1831. By reading Kant, Schopenhauer wrote about 1816, the public was compelled to see that what is obscure is not always without significance. Fichte and Schelling, he thought, took undue advantage of Kant's success with obscurity. But, Schopenhauer continued, the height of absurdity in serving up pure nonsense, in stringing together senseless and extravagant masses of words, such as had previously been known only in madhouses, was finally reached in Hegel, and became the instrument of the most beautiful mystification that has ever taken place, with a result which will appear fabulous to posterity and will remain as a monument of German stupidity. 1. Skeptic's Progress. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was alive and flourishing when this dirge was published in 1818. He survived another 13 years. He came of a Stuttgart middle-class family steeped in mysticism and piety. The family property was mortgaged to send Georg to study theology at Tübingen Seminary from 1788 to 1793. Hölderlin was poet there, and Schelling came in 1790. Together they deplored the ignorance of their teachers and applauded the victories of revolutionary France. Hegel developed a special fondness for Greek drama, and his praise of Greek patriotism foreshadowed his own final political philosophy. To the Greek, the idea of his fatherland, the state, was the invisible, the higher reality for which he labored. In comparison with this idea, his own individuality was nothing. It was its endurance, its continued life that he sought. To desire or pray for permanence or eternal life for himself as an individual could not occur to him. After graduating from the seminary with a degree in theology, Hegel disappointed his parents by refusing to enter the ministry. He supported himself by tutoring at Bern in the home of a patrician with a substantial library. There, and later at Frankfurt, he read Thucydides, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Montesquieu, Locke, Voltaire, Hume, Kant, Fichte. How could his ailing Christian faith resist such a phalanx of doubters? The natural rebelliousness of a vigorous youth reveled in the pagan feast. In the year 1796, he wrote a Life of Jesus, which remained unpublished till 1905. It was, in part, in anticipation of Das Leben Jesu of 1835, with which David Strauss, a follower of Hegel, launched a full-scale attack upon the gospel story of Christ. Hegel described Jesus as the son of Joseph and Mary. He rejected the miracles ascribed to Christ, or explained them naturally. He pictured Christ as defending the individual conscience against priestly rules. He ended with the burial of the crucified rebel and said nothing of a resurrection. And he gave a definition of God which he was to hold to the end. Pure reason, incapable of any limitation, is the deity itself. In 1799, Hegel's father died, leaving him 3,154 florins. He wrote to Schelling asking advice in finding a town with a good library and ein gutes Bier. Schelling recommended Jena and offered to share his quarters with him. In 1801, Hegel came and was allowed to lecture at the university as a Privatdozent, remunerated only by his pupils, who numbered 11. After 3 years of such servitude, he was appointed Professor Extraordinarius. And a year later, on Goethe's intervention, he received his first stipend, 100 thalers. He never became a popular teacher, but at Jena, as later in Berlin, he inspired in several students a special attachment that penetrated the rough surface of his language to the arcane vigor of his thought. In 1801, he began, but left unfinished and unpublished, a significant essay, on the Constitution of Germany, published in 1893. Looking out upon Germany, he was reminded of the petty principalities that had divided Renaissance Italy and opened it to foreign conquest. And he remembered Machiavelli's plea for a strong prince who would hammer these scattered pieces into a nation. He put no faith in the Holy Roman Empire and foretold its early collapse. Germany is no longer a state. A group of human beings can call itself a state only if it is joined together for the common defense of the entirety of its property. He called for the unification of Germany, but he added, "Such an event has never been the fruit of reflection, but only of force. The common multitude of the German people must be gathered into one mass by the force of a conqueror." Presumably, he had no notion of summoning Napoleon, but when, in 1805, Napoleon overwhelmed both the Austrians and the Russians at Austerlitz, Hegel may have begun to wonder whether this man was destined to unify not only Germany, but all Europe. When, in the following year, the French army was approaching Jena, and the future of Europe seemed at stake, Hegel saw Napoleon riding through Jena on October 13, 1806, and wrote to his friend Niethammer, "I saw the Emperor, that world soul, riding out to reconnoiter the city. It is a truly wonderful sensation to see such an individual, concentrated here at a single point, astride a single horse, yet reaching across the world and ruling it. To make such progress from Thursday to Monday is possible only for that extraordinary man, whom it is impossible not to admire. All now wish good fortune to the French army." On the next day, the French army prevailed, and some French soldiers, eluding the eye of the world soul, began to plunder in the city. One group entered Hegel's rented room. Seeing the cross of the Legion of Honor on a corporal's coat, the philosopher expressed the hope that so distinguished a man would treat a simple German scholar honorably. These invaders settled for a bottle of wine, but the spread of looting frightened Hegel into taking refuge in the office of the university vice president. On February 5, 1807, Christina Burckhardt, wife of Hegel's landlord, gave birth to a boy whom the absent-minded professor recognized as one of his anonymous works. As the Duke of Saxe-Weimar was hard put to finance the Jena faculty, Hegel thought it a good time to try another city, woman, and task. On February 20th, he left Jena to become editor of the Bamberger Zeitung. Amid the turmoil, he published, in 1807, Phänomenologia des Geistes. No one seems to have suspected that this would later be ranked as his masterpiece, and as the most difficult and seminal contribution to philosophy between Kant and Schopenhauer. Irked by governmental censorship of his paper, Hegel left Bamberg in 1808 to become headmaster of a gymnasium in Nuremberg. He labored conscientiously in this new field, teaching as well as directing, but he longed for a secure and fitter berth in a distinguished and solvent university. On September 16, 1811, age 41, he married Maria von Tücker, the 20-year-old daughter of a Nuremberg senator. Shortly thereafter, Christina Burckhardt surprised the couple with a visit in which she offered them Hegel's 4-year-old son, Ludwig. His wife met the situation bravely by adopting the boy into her family. Dreaming of a post in Berlin, Hegel accepted in 1816 an invitation from the University of Heidelberg to be its first professor of philosophy. His class began with 5 students, but grew to 20 before the term was over. There he published, in 1817, his Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. It pleased both the intelligentsia and the government of Berlin much more than his Logic, which had appeared there in 1812. Soon the Prussian Minister of Education invited him to come and fill the chair of philosophy which had been left vacant since the death of Fichte in 1814. Hegel, now 47, bargained until the remuneration finally offered him atoned for his long wait. Besides the $2,000 yearly salary, he asked something to compensate for the high rents and prices in Berlin, for the furniture he had bought and would now have to sell at a loss, for the cost of travel to Berlin with his wife and children. Furthermore, he would like a certain quantity of produce. All this having been granted, Hegel, on October 22, 1818, began at the University of Berlin the long tenure that would end with his death. In those 13 years, his lectures, notoriously dull but finally meaningful, drew larger and larger audiences until students came from almost every country in Europe and beyond to hear him. Now he gave form and order to the most complete and influential system of thought in the history of post-Kantian Europe. 2. Logic as metaphysics. He begins with logic, not in our modern sense as the rules of reasoning, but in the ancient and classic sense as the ratio, or rationale, or basic meaning and operation of anything, as when we use geology, biology, or psychology for the meaning and operation of the earth, life, or mind. So, to Hegel, logic studies the meaning and operation of anything. Generally, he leaves the operations to science, as science leaves the meaning to philosophy. He proposes to analyze not the words in reasoning, but the reason or logic in realities. To the source and sum of these reasons he will give the name of God, very much as ancient mystics identified the deity with the Logos, the reason and wisdom of the world. The perceiving mind gives specific meaning to objects by studying their relationships, in space and time, with other objects remembered or perceived. Kant had given to such relationships the name of categories, and had listed 12, chiefly unity, plurality, and totality, reality, negation, and limitation, cause and effect, existence and non-existence, contingency and necessity. Hegel adds many more: determinate being, limit, multiplicity, attraction and repulsion, likeness and difference. Each object in our experience is a complex web of such relationships. This table, for example, has specific place, age, form, strength, color, weight, odor, beauty. Without such specific relations, the table would be merely a confusion of obscure and separate sensations. With them, the sensations become a united perception. This perception, illuminated by memory and pointed by purpose, becomes an idea. Hence, for each of us, the world is our sensations, external or internal, coordinated by the categories into perceptions and ideas, mingled with our memories and manipulated by our wills. The categories are not things, they are ways and tools of understanding, giving form and meaning to sensations. They constitute the rationale and logic, the structure and reason of each experienced feeling, thought, or thing. Together they constitute the logic, reason, logos of the universe, as conceived by Hegel. The simplest and most universal of the categories through which we may seek to understand our experience is pure being, or sein. Being as applied to all objects or ideas without particularization. The universality of this basic category is its fatality. By lacking any distinguishing form or mark, it cannot represent any existing object or idea. Hence, the concept of pure being is in effect equivalent to its opposite category, non-being or nothing, nichts. Hence, they readily mingle. That which was not is added to being and deprives it of its indeterminateness or purity. Being and non-being become something, however negative. This mysterious becoming, or werden, is the third category, the most useful of all, since without it nothing can be conceived as happening or taking form. All subsequent categories flow from similar combinations of apparently contradictory ideas. This Hegelian prestidigitation, producing the world, like Adam and Eve, out of a conjunction, recalls the medieval idea that God created the world out of nothing. But Hegel protests that his categories are not things. They are ways of conceiving things, of making their behavior intelligible, often predictable, sometimes manageable. He asks us to allow some modification in the principle of contradiction, so sacred in the old logic, that A cannot be not A. Very well, but A may become not A, as water can become ice or steam. All reality, as conceived by Hegel, is in a process of becoming. It is not a static Parmenidean world of being, but a fluid Heraclitean world of becoming. All things flow. All reality in Hegel, all thoughts and things, all history, religion, philosophy, are in constant evolution, not by a natural selection of variations, but by the development and resolution of internal contradictions, and the advance to a more complex stage. This is the famous Hegelian, formerly Fichtean, dialectic, literally the art of conversation, of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. An idea or situation potentially contains its opposite, develops it, struggles against it, then unites with it to take another transient form. A logical discussion would follow the dialectical structure of exposition, opposition, and reconciliation. Sensible deliberations, the weighing of ideas and desires on the scale, or libera, of experience, would do likewise. Interruption, as Madame de Staël insisted, is the life of conversation, but is its death if the contradiction is not pertinent and resolved. Opposition absorbed is the secret of wisdom and the perfection of victory. A true synthesis rejects neither the affirmative nor the negative, but finds room for elements of each. Karl Marx, a disciple of Hegel, thought that capitalism contained the seeds of socialism, that the rival forms of economic organization must clash in a war to the death, and that socialism would prevail. A more consistent Hegelian would have predicted a union of both, as in Western Europe today. Hegel was the most thoroughgoing of Hegelians. He undertook to deduce the categories, to show how each of them necessarily resulted from the resolution of contradictions in its predecessors. He organized his arguments, tried to divide each of his works on a triadic form. He applied his dialectic to realities as well as to ideas. The repetitive process of contradiction, conflict, and synthesis appears in politics, economics, philosophy, and history. He was a realist in the medieval sense. The universal is more real than any of its contained particulars. Man includes all men, briefly alive or durably dead. The state is realer, more important, and longer living than any of its citizens. Beauty has immortal power, makes many wrecks and rhymes, though Pauline Bonaparte is dead and perhaps Aphrodite never lived. Finally, the compulsive philosopher carried his parade of categories to the most real, inclusive, and powerful of them all. The absolute idea that is the universal of all things and thoughts, the reason, structure, or law that upholds the cosmos, the logos that crowns and rules the whole. 3. Mind. The Phenomenologia des Geistes was written at Jena while the Grande Armée was approaching the city. It was published in 1807, when the merciless devastation of Prussia by the sons of the French Revolution seemed to prove that somewhere in that historic groping from monarchy through terror to monarchy, the mind of man had lost the road to freedom. Hegel proposed to study the mind of man in its various phenomena as sensation, perception, feeling, consciousness, memory, imagination, desire, will, self-consciousness, and reason. Perhaps at the end of that long road he would find the secret of liberty. Not frightened by that program, he would also study the human mind in communities and the state, in art and religion and philosophy. The product of his quest was his chef-d'œuvre, eloquent and obscure, challenging and discouraging, and pregnant with influence upon Marx and Kierkegaard, Heidegger and Sartre. The difficulty begins with the word Geist, which spreads a cloud of ambiguities over ghost and mind and spirit and soul. We shall usually translate it as mind, but in some contexts it may be better rendered as spirit, as in Zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. Geist as mind is not a separate substance or entity behind psychological activities. It is those activities themselves. There are no separate faculties. There are only the actual operations by which experience is transformed into action or thought. In one of his many definitions of Geist, Hegel identified it with consciousness. Consciousness, of course, is the mystery of mysteries, for as the organ for interpreting experience, it cannot interpret itself. Nevertheless, it is the most immediate as well as the most remarkable fact known to us. Matter, which may be the outside of mind, seems less mysterious, even though less directly known. Hegel agrees with Fichte that we know objects only insofar as they become part of us as subjects perceiving. But he never questions the existence of an external world. When the object perceived is another individual apparently endowed with mind, consciousness becomes self-consciousness by opposition. Then the consciously personal ego is born and becomes uncomfortably aware that competition is the trade of life. Then, says our tough philosopher, each man, potentially, ultimately, and seldom consciously, aims at the destruction and death of the other, until one of the two accepts subordination or is dead. Meanwhile, the ego is feeding upon experience, as if aware that it must arm and strengthen itself for the trials of life. All that complex process by which the ego transforms sensations into perceptions, stores these in memory, and turns them into ideas, is used to illuminate color and serve the desires that make up the will. The ego is a focus, succession, and combination of desires. Percepts, ideas, memories, deliberation, like arms and legs, are tools of the self or ego seeking survival, pleasure, or power. If the desire is a passion, it is thereby reinforced, for good or ill. It must not be condemned indiscriminately, for nothing great in the world has been accomplished without passion. It may lead to pain, but that does not matter if it contributes to the desired result. Life is made not for happiness, but for accomplishment. Is the will, i.e., our desires, free? Yes, but not in the sense of freedom from causality or law. It is free in proportion as it agrees with the laws and logic of reality. A free will is one enlightened by understanding and guided by reason. The only real liberation for the nation or the individual is through the growth of intelligence, and intelligence is knowledge coordinated and used. The highest freedom is in the knowledge of the categories and their operation in the basic processes of nature, and their union and harmony in the absolute idea, which is God. There are three ways in which man can approach this summit of understanding and freedom: through art, religion, and philosophy. Briefly in the Phänomenologia, more fully in his posthumous Vorlesungen über Ästhetik, Hegel tried to bring the nature and history of art under the triadic formulas of his system. Incidentally, he revealed a surprising knowledge of architecture, sculpture, painting, and music, and a detailed acquaintance with the art collections of Berlin, Dresden, Vienna, Paris, and the Netherlands. Art, he felt, was an attempt of the mind, by intuition, i.e., direct, intense, persistent perception, rather than by reason, to represent spiritual significance through a sensory medium. He distinguished three major epochs of art. One, the Oriental, in which architecture sought to support the spiritual life and mystical vision through massive temples, as in Egypt and India. Two, the Greco-Roman classical, conveying the ideals of reason, balance, and harmony through perfect sculptural forms. And three, the Christian romantic, which has sought, through painting, music, and poetry, to express the emotions and longings of the modern soul. In this third stage, Hegel found some seeds of degeneration, and suggested that the greatest period of art was coming to an end. Religion troubled and puzzled him in his declining years, for he recognized its historic function in molding character and supporting social order, but he was too fond of reason to care for the gropings of theology, the ecstasies and sufferings of saints, the fear and worship of a personal God. He struggled to reconcile the Christian creed with the Hegelian dialectic, but his heart was not in the effort, and his most influential followers interpreted his God as the impersonal law or reason of the universe, and immortality as the lingering, perhaps endless, effects of every soul's moment on the earth. Toward the end of the Phänomenologia, he revealed his true love, philosophy. His ideal was not the saint, but the sage. In his enthusiasm, he recognized no limit to the future extension of human understanding. The nature of the universe has no power which can permanently resist the courageous effort of the intelligence. It must at last open itself up. It must reveal all its depth and riches to the spirit. But long before that culmination, philosophy will have perceived that the real world is not the world that we touch or see, but the relationships and regularities that give them order and nobility, the unwritten laws that move the sun and the stars, and constitute the impersonal mind of the world. To that absolute idea or cosmic reason, the philosopher will pledge his loyalty. In it he will find his worship, his freedom, and a quiet content. 4. Morality, Law, and the State. In 1821, Hegel sent forth another major work, Outlines of the Philosophy of Right. Recht, or right, is a majestic word in German, covering both morality and law as kindred supports of the family, the state, and civilization. Hegel dealt with all of these in a magisterial volume which had lasting influence upon his people. The philosopher was now entering his 6th decade. He had become accustomed to stability and comfort. He was aspiring to some governmental post. He yielded readily to the natural conservatism of age. Moreover, the political situation had drastically changed since he feted France and admired Napoleon. Prussia had risen in arms and fury against Napoleon fleeing from Russia, had fought under Blücher and had overthrown the usurper, and now Prussia had re-established itself on a Frederiциan basis of victorious army and feudal monarchy as stanchions of stability, amid a people reduced by the costs of victory to desperate poverty, social disorder, and hopes and fears of revolution. In 1816, Jakob Fries, then holding the chair of philosophy at the University of Vienna, published a treatise on the German Confederation and the political constitution of Germany, in which he outlined a program of reform that frightened the German governments into the harsh decrees of the Carlsbad Congress of 1819. Fries was dismissed from his professorship and was declared an outlaw by the police. Hegel gave half the preface of his book to denouncing Fries as a dangerous simpleton and condemning as the quintessence of shallow thinking Fries's view that in a people ruled by a genuine communal spirit, life for the discharge of all public business would come from below, from the people itself. According to a view of this kind, Hegel protested, the world of ethics should be given over to the subjective accident of opinion and caprice. By the simple family remedy of ascribing to feeling, the labor of reason and intellect, all the trouble of rational insight and of knowledge directed by speculative thinking, is of course saved. The angry professor vented his scorn upon street-corner philosophers who construct perfect states any evening out of the rosy dreams of immaturity. Against such wishful thinking, he proclaimed, as the realistic basis of his philosophy, political as well as metaphysical, the principle that what is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. It is what the logic of events made it be, what, under the circumstances, it had to be. The liberals of Germany denounced the author as a time-serving place-seeker, the philosopher laureate of a reactionary government. He went on. Civilization needs both morality and law, since it means living like a citizen, and therefore in a community. And a community cannot survive unless it limits liberty in order to provide protection. Morality must be a common bond, not an individual preference. Freedom under law is a constructive force. Freedom from law is impossible in nature and destructive in society, as in some phases of the French Revolution. The restrictions laid upon individual liberty by custom morality, the ethical judgments developed in the evolution of a community, are the oldest and broadest, the most lasting and far-reaching measures taken by it for its continuance and growth. Since such regulations are transmitted chiefly by the family, the school, and the church, these institutions are basic to a society and constitute its vital organs. Therefore, it is foolish to let a family be founded by a love marriage. Sexual desire has its biological wisdom for continuing the species and the community, but it contains no social wisdom for supporting a lifetime partnership in the management of property and children. Marriage should be monogamous and divorce should be difficult. The property of the family should be held in common, but be managed by the husband. Woman has her substantive destiny in the family, and to be imbued with family devotion is her ethical frame of mind. Education should not, as in Pestalozzi and Fichte, make fetishes of freedom and play. Discipline is the backbone of character. The punishment of children does not aim at justice as such. The aim is to deter them from exercising a freedom still in the toils of nature, and to raise the universal into their consciousness and will. nor should we make a fetish of equality. We are equal only in the sense that each of us is a soul and should not be a tool for another person. But we are obviously unequal in physical or mental ability. The best economic system is one in which superior ability is stimulated to develop itself and is left relatively free to transmute new ideas into productive realities. Property should be the private possession of the family, for without that distinguishing reward, superior ability would not train or exert itself. For the purpose of civilization, of turning savages into citizens, religion is an ideal instrument, for it relates the individual to the whole. Since religion is an integrating factor in the state, implanting a sense of unity in the depth of men's minds, the state should even require all its citizens to belong to a church. A church is all that can be said because, since the content of a man's faith depends upon his private ideas, the state cannot interfere with it. The churches should be separate from the state, but should look upon the state as a consummate worship, in which the religious goal of the unification of the individual with the totality is as nearly effected as is possible on earth. The state, then, is man's highest achievement. It is the organ of the community for the protection and development of the people. It has the difficult task of reconciling social order with the natural individualism of men and the jealous conflicts of internal groups. Law is the freedom of civilized man, for it frees him from many injustices and perils in return for his agreement not to inflict them upon other citizens. The state is the actuality of concrete freedom. To so transform chaos into orderly liberty, the state must have authority and sometimes must use force. Police will be necessary, and in crisis, conscription too. But if the state is well managed, it can be called the organization of reason. In this sense, we may say of the state, as of the universe, that the rational is real and the real is rational. It is not utopic, but utopia is unreal. Was this an idealization of the Prussian state of 1820? Not quite. Unlike that regime, it assumed the full success of Stein's and Hardenberg's reforms. It called for a limited monarchy, constitutional government, freedom of worship, and the emancipation of the Jews. It condemned despotism, which it defined as any state of affairs where law has disappeared, and when the particular will as such, whether of a monarch or a mob, ochlocracy, counts as law or takes the place of law, while it is precisely in legal constitutional government that sovereignty is to be found as the moment of ideality. Hegel rejected democracy outright. The ordinary citizen is ill-equipped to choose competent rulers or to determine national policy. The philosopher accepted the French Revolutionary Constitution of 1791, which called for a constitutional monarchy in which the people voted for a national assembly but not for a ruler. An elective monarchy is the worst of all institutions. So Hegel recommended a government composed of a bicameral legislature elected by property owners, an executive and administrative cabinet of ministers, and an hereditary monarch having the will with the power of ultimate decision. The development of the state to constitutional monarchy is the achievement of the modern world. It would be unfair to call this philosophy reactionary. It was quite in line with the reasoned conservatism of Montaigne and Voltaire, Burke and Macaulay, Benjamin Constant advising Napoleon, and Tocqueville after studying the French and American governments. It left some room for individual freedom of thought and for religious toleration. We must view it in its context in place and time. We must imagine ourselves in the maelstrom of post-Napoleonic Europe, with its bankruptcy and depression, and its reactionary governments trying to restore the Ancien Régime. To understand the reaction of a thinker too advanced in years to be adventurous in thought, too comfortably established to relish the ecstasy of revolution, or risk the replacement of an old government with inexperienced theorists or mob rule. It was the hasty preface, not the carefully organized and considered book, that was unworthy of a philosopher. The old man was frightened by Fries's eloquence and its excited reception. He called for the police, and he was not sorry that governments have at last directed their attention to this kind of philosophy. It is not for age to venture, but to preserve. 5. History. Hegel's students must have loved him, for after his death they pored over his notes, adding their own records of his lectures, arranging the result in some reasonable order, and issued it over his name. So appeared 4 posthumous books: Aesthetics, Philosophy of Religion, Philosophy of History, and History of Philosophy. They are the most intelligible of his works, perhaps because least obscured by the complexity of his thought and style. The only thought which philosophy brings with it to the contemplation of history is the simple concept of reason. That reason, the logic and law of events, is the sovereign of the world, that therefore the history of the world presents us a rational process. Here, too, the actual was rational. It was the only logical and necessary result of its antecedents. Hegel often speaks of his sovereign reason in religious terms, but he defines it by mating Spinoza and Newton. Reason is the substance of the universe, viz., that by which and in which all reality has its being and subsistence. And, on the other hand, it is the infinite energy of the universe, i.e., the categories of the logic are based upon means of understanding the operative relations which constitute the infinite complex of things, their entire essence and truth. If the operations of history are an expression of reason, of the laws inherent in the nature of things, there must be some method in the apparent whimsy of events. Hegel sees method in both the process and the result. The process of reason in history, as in logic, is dialectical. Each stage or condition, thesis, contains contradictions, antithesis, which struggle to compose a synthesis. So despotism tried to suppress the human hunger for freedom. The hunger broke out in revolt. Their synthesis was constitutional monarchy. Is there then a general or total design behind the course of history? No, if this means a conscious supreme power guiding all causes and effects to a determined goal. Yes, insofar as the widening stream of events, as a civilization advances, is moved by the total of Geist or mind to bring man closer and closer to his absorbing goal, which is freedom through reason. Not freedom from law, though that conceivably might come if intelligence should reach its full growth, but freedom through law. So the evolution of the state can be a boon to liberty. This progress toward freedom is not continuous, for in the dialectic of history there are contradictions to be resolved, oppositions to be transformed into fusion, centrifugal diversities to be drawn toward a unifying center by the character of the age or the work of exceptional men. These two forces, the time and the genius, are the engineers of history, and when they work together they are irresistible. Hegel, inspiring Carlyle, believed in heroes and hero worship. Geniuses are not necessarily virtuous, though it is a mistake to think that they are selfish individualists. Napoleon was no mere conqueror for the sake of conquest. He was, consciously or not, the agent of Europe's greater need for unity and consistent laws. But the genius is helpless unless, consciously or not, he embodies and serves the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. Such individuals had insight into the requirements of the time, what was ripe for development. This was the very truth for their age, for their world, the species next in order, so to speak, and which was already formed in the womb of time. If the genius is born on such a tide, like Galileo, Franklin, or James Watt, he will be a force for growth, even if he brings misery for an entire generation. The genius is not meant to peddle happiness. The history of the world is not the theater of happiness. Periods of happiness are the blank pages in it, for they are periods of harmony, when the antithesis is in abeyance. And history sleeps. The chief obstacle to interpreting history as progress is the fact that civilizations can die or entirely disappear. But Hegel was not the man to let such incidents disrupt his dialectic. He divided man's past, as aforesaid, into 3 periods, the Oriental, the Greco-Roman, and the Christian, and saw some progress in their succession. The Orient gave freedom to one man as absolute ruler. Classical antiquity gave freedom to a caste using slaves. The Christian world, giving each person a soul, sought to free all. It encountered resistance in the traffic in slaves, but this conflict was resolved in the French Revolution. At this point, about 1822, Hegel broke out into a surprising paean to that upheaval, or to its first 2 years. The political condition of France had presented nothing but a confused mass of privileges, altogether contravening thought and reason, with the greatest corruption of morals and spirit. The change was necessarily violent, because the work of transformation was not undertaken by the government, was opposed by the court, the clergy, and the nobility. The idea of right asserted its authority, and the old framework of injustice could offer no resistance to its onslaught. It was a glorious mental dawn. All thinking beings shared in the jubilation. A spiritual enthusiasm filled the world. Mob violence darkened that dawn, but after the blood was washed away, substantial progress remained. And Hegel was still cosmopolitan enough to recognize that the French Revolution had brought substantial benefits to much of Germany. The Code Napoleon, the abolition of feudal privileges, the enlargement of freedom, the spread of property ownership. All in all, Hegel's analysis of the French Revolution in the final pages of The Philosophy of History proves that the frightened conservative had not quite repudiated the ideals of his youth. He considered it a main fault of the revolution that it made an enemy of religion. Religion is reason's highest and most rational work. It is absurd to maintain that priests have thought up religion for the people as a fraud for their own benefit. Consequently, it is folly to pretend to invent and carry out political constitutions independently of religion. Religion is the sphere in which the nation gives itself the definition of that which it regards as the true. The concept of God, therefore, constitutes the general basis of a people's character. Conversely, the shape which the perfect embodiment of spirit assumes is the state. Fully developed, the state becomes the basis and center of the other concrete elements of the life of a people, of art, law, morals, religion, science. Supported and justified by religion, the state becomes divine. Aspiring to produce a system of philosophy unified by one basic formula of explanation, Hegel applied his dialectic to one field after another. To his philosophy of history, his students, after his death, added his history of philosophy. The famous ancient systems of universal analysis, in this view, followed a sequence basically corresponding to the evolution of the categories in the logic. Parmenides stressed being and stability. Heraclitus stressed becoming, development, change. Democritus saw objective matter. Plato saw subjective idea. Aristotle provided the synthesis. Each system, like each category and each generation, enclosed and added to its predecessors, so that a full understanding of the last system would comprehend them all. What each generation has brought forward as knowledge and spiritual creation, the next generation inherits. This inheritance constitutes its soul, its spiritual substance. Since Hegel's philosophy was the latest in the great chain of philosophical imaginations, it included, in its author's view, all the basic ideas and values of all major preceding systems, and was their historical and theoretical culmination. 6. Death and Return. His time, for a time, almost took him at his own estimate. His classes grew despite his dour temper and abstruse style. Prominent men, Cousin and Michelet from France, Hebert from Denmark, came from afar to see him balance the universe in his categories. He was honored in Paris in 1827, and by old Goethe on the way home. In 1830, his certainties were shaken by the spread of radical movements and revolutionary agitation. He denounced them, and in 1831 he issued across the waters an appeal for the defeat of the Reform Bill that marked the rise of democracy in England. He rephrased his philosophy more and more in terms acceptable to Protestant divines. Still only 61, and apparently in full vigor, he fell victim to a cholera epidemic and died in Berlin, November 14, 1831. He was buried, as he had wished, beside the grave of Fichte. As if in testimony to his cautious obscurity, his students divided into antipodal groups. The Hegelian right, led by Johann Erdmann, Kuno Fischer, and Karl Rosenkranz, and the Hegelian left, Ludwig Feuerbach, David Strauss, Bruno Bauer, and Karl Marx. The right excelled in scholarship, but declined as higher criticism of the Bible grew. The left expanded in attacks upon religious and political orthodoxy. The left interpreted Hegel's identification of God and reason to mean that nature, man, and history are subject to invariable and impersonal laws. Feuerbach quoted Hegel as saying, "Man knows about God only insofar as God knows about himself within man," i.e., the reason of the universe becomes conscious only in man. Only man can think of cosmic laws. Marx, who knew Hegel chiefly through the master's writings, transformed the dialectical movement of the categories into the economic interpretation of history, in which the class war superseded the heroes as a main agent of progress, and socialism became the Marxian synthesis of capitalism and its internal contradictions. Hegel's reputation faded for a time as Schopenhauer's sarcastic passions swept the philosophic board. Philosophers of history were lost in the advance of historical scholarship. Hegelianism seemed dead in Germany, but it had risen to new life in Great Britain with John and Edward Caird, T.H. Green, J.M.E. McTaggart, and Bernard Bosanquet. When it died in England, it rose again in the United States. Perhaps the echoes of Hegel's worship of the state helped to pave the way for Bismarck and Hitler. Meanwhile, Søren Kierkegaard, Karl Jaspers, Martin Heidegger, and Jean-Paul Sartre found in the Phänomenologia des Geistes a virile note of human competition in a world apparently shorn of divine guidance, and Hegel became the godfather of existentialism. All in all, this age of Goethe, Beethoven, and Hegel was one of the high-water points in the history of Germany. It had reached or neared such peaks before, as in the Renaissance and the Reformation, but the 30 Years' War had shattered the economic and intellectual life of the people and had darkened the soul of Germany almost to despair through 100 years. Slowly, the native vigor of her stock, the stoic patience of her women, the skill of her craftsmen, the enterprise of her merchants, and the power and depth of her music prepared her to receive and transform to her own taste and character such foreign influences as England's Shakespeare and her romantic poets, the Enlightenment and Revolution of France. She moderated Voltaire into Goethe and Wieland, Rousseau into Schiller and Richter. She answered Napoleon with a war of liberation and cleared the way for the manifold achievements of her people in the 19th century. Civilization is a collaboration as well as a rivalry. Therefore, it is good that each nation has its own culture, government, economy, dress, and songs. It has taken many diverse forms of organization and expression to make the European spirit so subtle and diverse, and to make the Europe of today an endless fascination and an inexhaustible heritage.